Next on the setup screen, we're going to log in as the administrator. So 6750 is your password. At that point, you get access to a bunch of different screens or other parameters that are for higher level use and not meant for a standard operator to have access to. One of the screens is system parameters. So we go into those group of screens. We have a whole list of different options we can go with. One of the first ones is system timers. On the screen, we have access to a machine start delay, carriage back time. A lot of these delays are for how long it should take to delay the signal for a limit switch. For example, when the carriage comes up and hits the upper limit switch, wait 0.1 seconds before we truly consider that signal on. So this has nothing to do with the fault as much as just delaying the time for that signal to come on. Now, a lot of these parameters have NAs on them, indicating that this option has not been installed on the machine. So, for example, this machine doesn't have a clamp, doesn't have a shuttle, thus you don't have access to those parameters. We've also repeated the purge cycle time on this screen. This is no different than when you look in the manual screen and see the purge cycle time. That's the same parameter as what you see here. Another group is the fault timers. Now these timers will generate a fault. So again, with the carriage back time, 10 seconds, if we do not see the switch turn on after 10 seconds after the carriage has been commanded to go up, we will generate a fault. Again, a lot of other these parameters have been turned off because they have not been installed on this machine. Another group is the hopper fault warnings. So you have a warning and a fault. So if the hopper is determined running out of material, and the way we determine that is if we don't really see a positional change out of the injector after so much time, which is defined by these fault timers, you will either get a warning or a fault. So if we set, for example, 30 seconds for the low warning, if we do not see a positional change after 30 seconds, you will get a warning. This is just, doesn't really do anything on the machine. It's just an indicator to the operator that, hey, we think the hopper might be empty. If I put 30 seconds down for the other fault, it will indicate that, hey, after 30 seconds of not seeing positional change on that, we will generate a fault, which will actually stop the cycle from running. Now, so if in this case, I have both a warning and a fault, the warning would have to trigger first before we start counting for the fault. If I zero out the warning, it's 30 seconds to a fault. Versus if I put the 30 seconds in the warning, you really have 60 seconds till you get to the fault. If I don't want these ever to turn on at all, I set them to 0, and that fault will not be able to happen. A lot of cases on almost all the fault conditions, if you put in a 0, I will disable that fault from ever occurring. Well, the next one is position window. So the injector and maybe the carriage or some of these axes have a window to a target window to hit. So for example, if the injector, we want to get to a shot size of 1 inch, we allow in this case plus or minus 0.1 inch to be within that 1 inch distance for the shot size. Mostly has to do with the hydraulics accuracy for stopping in time. The carriage close window is in PSI, and what this relates to is more as we close down on the carriage. Say, for example, you want to close at 500 PSI, we allow for plus or minus 50 PSI of hitting that 1000, so we consider ourselves closed in the mold. We also have soft over travel limits on this screen. So the injector, the maximum it's allowed to travel up is 3 inches. Some machines have an option where they can go a little bit farther than 3 inches. So in this case, we put a software limit saying that you shall not travel any farther than that. Machine idle is another feature we've added to these machines over time. So the hydraulic pump, for example, we could set to 10 minutes. So if the hydraulic pump has been running or the heaters have been on and the machine has not been cycled in a set amount of time, for example, if we set both of these to 10 minutes, so if the machine hasn't done anything for 10 minutes, the machine will automatically turn off the hydraulic pump and will automatically turn off the barrel heaters. If again you set these to 0, that disables that function, so this will not happen. We also have what's known as an idle mode or cutback option. So again, we can set that for 10 minutes. If the machine has not cycled for 10 minutes, the machine will automatically, or the heaters will automatically go to an idle state. An idle state is defined by this next parameter, 75%. So if we had our heaters at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, they will drop down to 300 degrees Fahrenheit because we set a 75% output reduction. So at that point in idle, heaters at 300% or 300 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 400. Again, if we set this parameter to 0, that disables this function from ever happening. There's also options for hardware. So this machine right now is configured for a 55p, but again, it can be run as a 60, 70, and 75. There is no benefit of changing a machine from a 55p to a 70 because ideally it's just hardware that's missing. We've just kept the program very consistent that this program is used to run both a 55p, a 60, 70, and 75 machine. And all we do is go through this screen and set up whether you have a clamp or not, safety gates, air inject, dual recipes, mold heat, hopper sensor. Again, there's no benefit of turning these on. This is mostly used for MPM factory personnel to set that up for the customer. If the customer would change this, they're probably going to get more faults for the fact that those functions aren't even there, weren't physically installed on the machine. There is some screen options. This is where we do the recall of the last screen. By default, these are all enabled, but again, the auto screen manual and recipe have multiple subscreens, and this is just to remember, hey, if I was on the packing screen on recipes, if I left that screen and then came back to it, I'd be still back on that screen, not back to the first subscreen of that group. System overrides are generally more for MPM personnel to set up. Test mode, what this is used for is when the machines are initially built, there is no material in the machine. So if we want to auto cycle the machine with no material, we turn on test mode. And so what happens during a recovery cycle, since there is no material for the screw to pull into the barrel, the injector cylinders will start to raise the injector as if material is coming in. So it'll mimic a recovery cycle. Once we put material in, there's no reason to do test mode. Again, this is only to cycle the machine when there is no material. The end customer, there's absolutely no reason to do test mode. If test mode was left on by accident, a power cycle machine will automatically clear out test mode for you. Auto refill is an option if a customer wants to have or not. So when you first start a cycle, you have an option to define in recipe whether you want recovery at the beginning or end of the cycle. During most production, most people want recovery at the end of the cycle because it's better for cycle time of the machine. But auto refill, what the purpose of that is, if the operator started the machine and the machine noticed that you were not at shot size, with auto refill on, it would automatically fire a recovery cycle to get you to shot size, run through the normal cycle, and if a recovery was at the end, it would still do recovery at the end. This is more of a convenience feature of you don't have to worry about doing a recovery before you start a cycle. The cycle will just automatically do it for you. Auto home is another thing that we've added for the 70s and 75s. It's an option to get the clamps and the carriage, everything else back to a more of a starting position for the machine. Most times we leave this off because it's really not that difficult to get the machine set up the way it's supposed to.